start. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our lecture with Dr. Sara Hirschhorn. I want to thank you for accommodating our need to change the program this evening to a Zoom format. I'm so happy to see all of you here in this extraordinary time. I feel that I have to address the unspeakable horrors that we have just witnessed in my introductory remarks before we transition to our lecture this evening, which I think will be quite timely considering the topic. As we all know by now, early in the morning of October 7th on Shabbat and the Jewish holiday of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, the Hamas terrorist organization launched a full-scale surprise attack and invasion of Israel, infiltrating communities in Israel's south, massacring civilians, taking hostages, and indiscriminately firing thousands of rockets and missiles at population centers throughout the country. Thus far, we know over 1,200 Israelis have been murdered, nearly 3,000 have been wounded, and at least 100 people, including women, children, and the elderly, have reportedly been kidnapped and taken as hostages into Gaza. The scenes from Israel are terrifying and devastating. Coming nearly 50 years to the day after the surprise attack launched against Israel in Yom Kippur in 1973, Saturday's attack is one of the most catastrophic and traumatic days in the country's 75-year history. Like many of you, I've reached out to family and friends in Israel. What they have seen and heard are things that we would once label beyond belief, except they are all sadly, shockingly too real. Some have described Saturday's horrific events as a pogrom, conventionally defined as a mob attack resulting in a massacre with the approval of authorities against persons and property of a religious, racial, or national group. To put Saturday's events in context, the infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1903, which seemed to be such a turning point in Jewish history, resulted in 49 deaths and the wounding of some 500 Jews. The murder, torture, mutilation of bodies, and sexual crimes against women, children, the elderly were nothing less than a pogrom perpetrated by Hamas. This is the deadliest attack against the Jewish people in a single day since the murderous onslaughts perpetrated by Nazis during the Second World War. This is face-to-face, perpetrator-to-innocent victim violence, which for the Jewish people can only remind us of horrific massacres perpetrated during the war. The University of Connecticut and the Yukon Center for Judaic Studies, of which I am the director, we've developed multiple partnerships with Israeli universities and other academic centers and institutes. And we're proud to send students to study in Israel every year with our faculty members and as part of study abroad programs in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem and Beersheba and elsewhere. And at this time of crisis, we stand together with them in solidarity and with our many other colleagues, partners, friends, and family members throughout Israel. Of course, our deepest sympathies lie with the victims. We wish a swift recovery to those injured, and we pray for the safety of all innocents now in harm's way, a full recovery, and a speedy return of all hostages. Many times in its past, Israel has overcome dark days through resilience and fortitude, and we send our most heartfelt wishes for continued strength to friends, colleagues, and relatives. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people are resilient. The Jewish people are strong. So I want to thank you for joining us this evening for our lecture, which was previously scheduled to take place today on Wednesday, October 11th with Dr. Sara Hirschhorn. And we're so grateful that she's able to join us for a topic that seems quite timely to discuss the history of the American Jewish relationship with Israel and how it's changed since 1967. And we believe that one of the most important things that we can do is to continue to teach and to learn about Israel, and for us also to have an opportunity to discuss the present events in the context of our recent past. So with that being said, I am really looking forward to learning from Dr. Sara Yael Hirschhorn, who is currently a fellow at the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL Center for Anti-Semitism Research, and a visiting professor at the University of Haifa. She was previously appointed as the visiting assistant professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern University from 2018 to 2022, and as the university research lecturer in Israel Studies at the University of Oxford before that from 2013 to 2018. Her research, teaching, and public engagement activities focus on diaspora-Israel relations, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Israeli ultranationalist movement. Her first book, City on a Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli Settler Movement, published by Harvard University Press in 2017, was the winner of the 2018 Sammy Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature Choice Award and a finalist for the 2017 National Jewish Book Award. She's currently working on a new manuscript entitled New Day in Babylon and Jerusalem, Zionism, Jewish Power, and Identity Politics since 1967 that will offer a transnational history of the post-Six-Day War period. Apart from her academic work, Dr. Hirschhorn is an internationally recognized public speaker, writer, educator, media commentator, and consultant on contemporary Jewish and Israel affairs. You can follow her work at Sara Hirschhorn1 at Twitter or X. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Hirschhorn. One technical note, as I've mentioned before, we're all muted for the lecture itself to minimize disruptions. However, I do encourage you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to type in questions as they come up. We will have plenty of time at the end of Sarah's lecture for Q&A and discussion, and this will be a moderated Q&A, and I will come back on the screen to ask Sarah questions. So thank you all again for being here, and I turn the screen over to Dr. Hirschhorn.
And I want to thank you, Avi, so much for having me, and to the UConn Center for Judaic Studies, as well as our co-sponsors at the University of Hartford and the Mandel JCC. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to gather today in person, but I'm very touched that you are all here. And I speak today with a very heavy heart, knowing many individuals who were personally affected by the recent events in Israel. I've heard, really truly horrific stories of atrocities really committed against the relatives of friends and colleagues, and the fear of many of my friends in Israel. I'm actually still here in Long Meadow, Massachusetts, as I was celebrating the Jewish holy days with my parents who lived here in Western Mass, but I am hopefully going to be returning to Israel soon to continue my work, research for my new book, and also to be teaching at the University of Haifa. And it's very chastening to hear updates from my, research group that 2 out of the 4 currently have been called up as reservists, and many, friends and family members are, sitting in their bomb shelters as we are listening to this lecture. So it's with, it's a difficult moment to be talking about Israel. And I want to say that these remarks were prepared ahead of time to address a lecture that Avi had asked me to present many, many weeks ago, certainly before we realized what the events of these past several days. But certainly in the questions and answers, I'd be very happy to speak more about current events, as much as some of the research findings that I hope to present. With that, I've been asked to speak generally about the research that I've done on diaspora-Israel relations that has really culminated in 2 book projects, as Avi mentioned, the first book that was published in 2017, and a new book that I'm currently working on. And I hope some of the findings that I want to present tonight will be useful for contextualizing the American Jewish relationship with Israel that really has undergone a change in the past 50 years. I will say as a bit of a preface that a very famous American Jewish sociologist named Marshall Scolaire polled the American Jewish people days after the 1967 war. And he found in those days that 99% of American Jewry stood in solidarity with Israel. I wonder if we could say the same today. Certainly many fissures have opened up, and a widening conversation in the past 50 years between American Jews and between the American Jewish community and other identity politics groups in the United States that I think are playing out in real time as we witness the reaction to these events. But I do want to take us back to a moment in history when on the eve of the 1967 war, and how this precipitated some changes in the American Jewish community, both inspiring activism by American Jews in Israel and within Israeli politics, including within the ultranationalist movement that has been subject to so much debate over this very, very hot summer in Israel, where we witnessed a great deal of unrest in the West Bank, as well as the way Israel has come to play a role in diaspora and domestic politics, especially here in the United States, which we are seeing being played out everywhere from Capitol Hill to the streets of world capitals as we speak in the last several days. So I hope that this will be an informative examination of both how things have changed, as well as what has stayed the same over the past 50 years, as we keep current events in mind. So with that, I want to share my screen with you, and I guess talk through some of the research that I've been doing over the last several years, which I hope will give us some insight into current events. Let me just make sure I enlarge that. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. So I want to devote the next half hour or so to speaking about the research I've been doing, which really seeks to integrate Jewish and Israeli history in the study of post-1967 diaspora Zionism. I've tried to examine the movement of people, narratives, and discourses in transnational and comparative context between diaspora Jewish communities and Israel. I'm interested in how Jews abroad influence domestic Israeli politics, and how Israel in turn has reciprocally impacted our own domestic politics here in the United States. The modern Jewish history that I research and write is about hyphenated identities and ideologies that have emerged out of these encounters between American Jewry and Israel, and how modern Jews really have tried to reconcile some of the dilemmas of Jewish power, how great power often demands great responsibility, which is at the heart of the two book projects that I've undertaken over the past decade or so of my career. I first want to speak about some of the findings of my first book, Sitting on a Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli Settler Movement, which was published in 2017, but unfortunately still feels resonant these years later, which examined the participation of over 60,000 American Jews within the Israeli settler movement in the occupied territories over the 5 decades since the 1967 war. Before I proceed further, I just wanted to offer a note on some of the language and terminology I want to use tonight. When I use the word occupied territories, this is to refer to the West Bank, and then at earlier points in time, as we are watching so poignantly in current events unfolding, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. Which I use instead of other terms that you may hear in the media or even in scholarly discussion, like disputed territories or Judea and Samaria. I use occupied territories as a juridical definition of the status of these pieces of land since the 1967 war, meaning they've been held by the state of Israel, and their populations have been under a military regime, as well as civilian settlement. But I want to, make clear that I understand that there are very significant resonances in popular debates that are often used as a kind of virtue signal to refer to Israel's behavior or conduct, or to make certain policy or political judgments about what the status and the future of these territories should be. And I want to, clarify that I use this only in a strictly limited definition. When you hear these words tonight, those are the terms I'm going to use, but if you want to use different ones in your questions, feel free to use the terminology that you feel comfortable with. So now that we've clarified that, I just wanted to say that this research was really motivated originally by the kind of settler stereotypes that you would see in the media, probably on the evening news if we were talking about a kind of regular day in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You're probably familiar with these images of religious settlers toting automatic machine guns on a windswept hilltop of the West Bank, or marauding in the Shuk or the closed market of Hebron, or even this summer in the Palestinian village of Huwara. But what if I told you that our scholarly and media understanding of the Israeli settler movement is really stuck at a moment in time in the 1970s, when the national religious camp had a near monopoly on the demographics and discourses of this movement as a whole, and that we really need to kind of update the face of the Israeli settler movement, which really looks something more like this, from the Toccoa Country Club to ultra-Orthodox settlers in a very large city on the West Bank border, to even the most recent previous prime minister of the state of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who's a multi-millionaire business entrepreneur and army professional who came to represent the national religious camp. And amongst this changing face of the Israeli settler movement that we may need to take into account is also the American face, our face. We may hold these truths to be self-evident that only in the last few years we've come to understand that there is really a deep and abiding relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. polity and the Israeli settler movement. That was kind of cheekily enshrined in this kiss between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu that was sprayed in graffiti on the West Bank separation barrier back in October 2017. We may even remember that Trump himself opened a campaign office in the West Bank settlement of Karnei Shomron, which I'll speak about a bit more in a few moments, to get out American Israeli votes for his campaign. U.S. Ambassador David Friedman and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, also had deep ties to several West Bank settlements, including that of Beit El. And we certainly felt that the Trump administration was perhaps the most pro-Israel presidency in American history. Biden himself, however, if we heard in this really monumental speech that he gave yesterday, also has a very strong relationship with Israel, but a somewhat more critical relationship with the Israeli settler movement, which has been the subject of serious policy debate over the last several months between the Netanyahu government and Israel, alongside, of course, the package of judicial reform, which is captured so much of our interest, but today suddenly feels on the sidelines of a much larger conflict. But I want to suggest that this goes far beyond, recent presidential administrations or American politics since 2016, but is really the story of over 60,000 American Jews that have settled in the West Bank and in previous years, even in the Gaza Strip or the Sinai Peninsula since 1967. In the introduction to my book, I actually asked my readers to meet Yonah and Malka Chaikin, formerly known as John and Marilyn Chaikin, who hailed from Springfield, Massachusetts. John, or then known as Yonah, was about the same age as my father. He went to the high school my uncle graduated from, Classical High, for those of you who know Springfield well, and had the bar mitzvah at the synagogue my grandfather helped found, and later went on to study at MIT, where he met his wife, Malka, who grew up in a conservative Jewish family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, around the time of the 1967 war. I was really struck by the parallels between my life and theirs. We seemingly shared so many landmarks and legacies of my own childhood, and our life stories, seem very consonant in some ways, but we made radically different professional and personal choices. What explains their arc, and perhaps the arc of so many others, including those from, West Hartford and other surrounding communities here near us, from my hometown of Springfield or Long Meadow, Massachusetts, to a West Bank settlement? Moving to Hebron in 1984, Yonah and Malka met a fellow Jewish American immigrant around the subject of settlers, particularly American Israeli settlers. He met this man on the left, Baruch Goldstein, who was born and raised in Brooklyn, a graduate of the Flatbush Yeshiva and Yeshiva University, and a follower of the radical American Israeli Rabbi Meir Kahane, as well as being a medical doctor who lived in the adjoining settlement of Kiryat Arba. The Chaikins and the Goldsteins soon became friends, and the Chaikins even appointed the Goldstein family as legal guardian of their 8 children. Yonah and Baruch prayed together in the same minyan or prayer quorum at the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, or the Tomb of the Patriarchs, also known as the Ibrahimi Mosque, on a regular basis. A decade later, Baruch Goldstein carried out a massacre at this same mosque and tomb. They killed 29 Muslim parishioners bound in prayer, wounded over 100 others, prompted international condemnation, and dealt one of several mortal blows to the Oslo peace process. In the wake of this terrible attack, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated less than a year later, fulminated before the full Knesset about Goldstein's foreign origins, railing, "This murderer grew up in a swamp whose origins are found here and across the sea. To him and those like him, we say, you are not part of the community of Israel. You are not part of the national democratic camp in this house where we belong. You are not partners in the Zionist enterprise. You are a foreign implant and an errant weed. Sensible Judaism spits you out. Certainly, some fellow Jewish American settlers felt tarred by this same brush, like those I met when I went about doing interviews for my first book. I met a man named Bob Lang, a settler in Efrat, who said, now we're all Baruch Goldsteins. But is it true that all American Israelis, these 60,000 American Jews who came to settle in the occupied territories, many who spent time within what we might call territorial Israel before their activist commitments led them across the Green Line, are all like Baruch Goldstein? In fact, there are two very common and contradictory caricatures of the demographics of this movement. The first is, of course, the Baruch Goldsteins, of which we spoke, but the other is more like the one on the image on the right. The immigrant suburbanite of occupied Scarsdale, a settler stripped of ideological significance who's living out a kind of new age yuppie American dream over the Green Line, a back to the land pioneer on the Westbank frontier. In fact, you might see that this singer, Orit Arfa, who does covers of major, pop hits in the United States, attuned to kind of Zionist lyrics, is sitting here wearing a pair of cowboy boots. Of course, this is in stark contrast to the zealots for Zion, the most fanatical ideologues within a controversial political and social movement that is in the Israelis, which is the Israeli settler movement. To me, neither of these images really offered a satisfying understanding of a very complex immigration movement. And I tried to answer this question of, are they all Baruch Goldsteins, in three ways. The first was a statistical and demographic profile of Jewish American settlers in the occupied territories. The second was to study three settlements that were founded by and for Jewish American immigrants in the occupied territories, which you may or may not have heard of, but contain tens of thousands of American Jews, often from our own communities here in the United States, that live in the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And last but not least, to try and analyze some of the discourses that Jewish American settlers have used, often drawn from the American Jewish 1960s, to justify and normalize this project to the international community. And many have become, in fact, spokespeople that you will see on your nightly television trying to address some of these questions. But first, I want to go back in time to the 1967 war generation to understand a little bit more about who these people are and how they ended up living, far away from our home communities here in West Hartford or Springfield to settle perhaps even at the center of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Certainly, the 1967 war was a major turning point for American Jews. It represented a watershed religiously, politically, ideologically, spiritually, and otherwise here in the United States. Many of you in this audience probably remember the 1967 war and the wall-to-wall coverage and a kind of cosmic drama that was playing out on radio transistor sets and synagogue pulpits and in the newspapers of the United States at the time. And certainly this really deeply affected a generation of American Jews who would later immigrate to Israel and settle even across the Green Line in the occupied territories. This had a significant impact on the findings of my research because these Jews who grew up in the 1967 generation really said that what I guess identified them most significantly amongst their peers was how these events and the years afterwards affected them as individuals. They were part, indeed, of the 1967 generation, a group of young, single, highly educated, to my interest, over 10% hold the doctorate, and upwardly mobile American Zionist activists who were profoundly impacted by the Six-Day War, and it later inspired them to immigrate to Israel. In contrast to the views of a member of Knesset who once derided American Jewry, who came to Israel as the dreck that America sent to the Holy Land, or the trash that was sent to the Holy Land, future Jewish American settlers were in many ways the elites of their American Jewish generation and also surpassed many of the then blue-collar characteristics of Israeli society at the time. You may have noticed that I've been deliberately using the term Jewish American immigrants. And that's a deliberate choice because this group put their Jewishness in front of their Americanness and this hyphenated identity in the years after the 1967 war. And in fact, they self-identified as some of the biggest Jewish identifiers of their generation, if not in terms of strict religious practice, but many as members of Zionist institutions and organizations, and primarily saw their Jewish identity as their core sense of self, which was the most salient feature of their life in the United States. Yet at the same time, they are very much part of the American Jewish 1960s. And one of the most interesting findings I thought that came out of my book was, in contrast to the popular perception that these were all Baruch Goldstein's, kind of fanatical, messianic followers of ultranationalist ideology. In fact, these were not people who were entirely concerned with Jewish issues, who were right-wing in their political views, or even Republican neocons in the United States. But in fact, the vast majority were those who had supported the Democratic Party and were active in and sympathetic to the liberal progressive movements of the 1960s and 1970s, including, very sure. They later borrowed from this ideology and some of the tactics of these 1960s movements in what they would describe as their own struggle for Jewish human and civil rights over the Green Line. So as this demographic profile revealed, they were something very different than those individuals that we may have first thought, or the stereotype we may have in our heads about who these people were. And also, I think, tells us a lot about how the 1967 war, perhaps much like the war that we are encountering today, may inspire a whole new generation of millennials, and their attitudes towards Israel had a deep and profound impact upon an entire generation. As the scholar Kevin Averill described about his own work, I want to argue that the story of these 60,000 individuals is really half about Jewishness in contemporary America and half about Americanness in contemporary Israel. For many American Jews after the 1967 war, the deep and abiding question, as Matthew Fry Jacobson, the Yale historian, once put it, was, given who I am, where do I belong? Perhaps for some, a very small percentage of the post-1967 generation in the United States, still a very salient and important one for this study, the answer to that question later was over the Green Line. I want to skip ahead and just suggest that there were also some other factors that I think made a significant difference in their life choices. We often talk about immigration to Israel as one of kind of pull factors, meaning that people aren't immigrating to Israel generally because of dire straits here in the United States or difficulties, war, famine, or other kinds of awful scenes that we can only, imagine in our heads today because of life here in the United States being so difficult. But I think that there's a little bit more to this story that we should understand as historians, that there were both push and pull factors bringing this generation to Israel after 1967 that sometimes aren't fully taken into account. And I've put up some quotes here on the screen, which hopefully you'll have a chance to peruse while I'm speaking. That will give a little bit more of a sense of how people were feeling. The first factor was the elevation of Holocaust discourse in American Jewish life in the 1960s. It wasn't that there was silence around the Holocaust prior to them, but certainly the understanding that the 1967 war perhaps could have been a new Holocaust in Israel, and the dire circumstances that American Jews thought that Israel was facing, even as certainly the preemptive strike by the Israeli Air Force against Egypt in the early morning of the war, and the very active affair sort of secured the future of the Jewish state. That didn't mean that American Jews weren't, frightened about the possibility of a second Holocaust. And as some of those who I interviewed later suggested, that they felt the burden of the Holocaust, some of them being the children of first-generation children of Holocaust survivors, very heavily, and they felt that if they didn't take action today, they would only be reliving a legacy of passivity and impotence of a previous generation in this new second Holocaust that seemed to be on the home. In a few moments, it's about the ethnic awakening in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. It really allowed for Jewish Americans to talk about themselves as Jewish-Americans. in a way that hadn't really been possible in a kind of melting pot ideology of the United States prior to Nix, and other groups were discovering the ability to, express their ethnic background alongside their American loyalties. So too were Jewish Americans at that time, and it really allowed a lot more space for self-consciously Jewish activism in an American context, something that I think we feel deeply as Americans today, that we can be progressive activists and Jews at the same time. And in fact, sometimes Judaism may inform our progressive or other forms of activism here in the United States. Of course, the last was the experience of being involved in activist movements here in America in the 1960s and 1970s. We know that Jews were overrepresented in the civil rights movement, as well as the anti-Vietnam struggle. And this provided kind of a training ground for many Jewish Americans who would later immigrate to Israel and then over the Green Line to try to put what they thought was their understanding of, Jewish civil rights and Jewish human rights into action, which may sound very strange to our ears and even quite cognitively dissonant, when we think about what the politics of the Israeli settler movement is today. But it's important to understand that these individuals were really seeing their work as a kind of continuity of their to a city on a hilltop to bring what they thought were, their values to a new project overseas. Now, certainly, I think we could say 50 years later that quite a lot has been lost in translation, but I want to talk through a little bit more about how they came to this understanding. But all of this doesn't necessarily explain why American Jews wouldn't have been content to live in the major cities of territorial Israel. Why is it that they immigrated not only to the state of Israel, but also to the occupied territories? And this is one of the questions that I tried to resolve, not only through some theoretical research, but also in trying to meet and understand those individuals who really taken part in this movement. And I did that by writing 3 in-depth case studies about settlements that had been founded by and for Jewish American immigrants in the occupied territories, and kind of meeting the individuals who came to spend their life over the Green Line, and why it was that they decided to settle at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want to skip ahead here to the first real section of my research, which began immediately after the 1967 war. And despite the fact that there were very, very few settlements between 1967 and 1973, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, we do find Americans at the earliest inception of the Israeli settler enterprise, including the reestablishment of Kibbutz Kfar Etzion, which is right outside of Jerusalem, in 1967, which had a Jewish community up until a very serious massacre in 1929, and then was resettled by Miriam Levinger and her husband, Moshe Levinger, who later became the head of one of the premier of the faithful in the 1970s. She famously came to settle in Hebron in 1967 during the Passover holiday, camping out in a hotel that had been previously used by Jordanian pilgrims visiting the Ibrahimi Mosque, where unfortunately this massacre took place in 1994, and famously brought her then 4 children, which would certainly grow, and her washing machine in tow. And at the end of the holiday of Passover, the Levinger family kind of cheekily sent a memo to the chief of command of the military regime in the occupied territory, saying, blessings on the Passover holiday. We're staying, and we wish you well. And they remained in the center of the city of Hebron until 1978. They remained in Hebron until 1972, when they were removed to the nearby settlement of Kiryat Arba, but later returned to the city center of Hebron in 1978, which was an initiative actually led by Miriam Levinger and other women at the time, which is a kind of interesting twist on I guess we could say feminist activism. But Americans after the Six-Day War also dreamed of very large-scale initiatives for the immigration of their brethren to the occupied territories. I found a curious document in the Israel State Archives entitled Shalom City, Israel, a proposal by a rabbi in Baltimore that described a kind of pleasant town USA that would have Americans, and even an annual celebration of Thanksgiving in Kennedy Hall, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians would come together to eat schnitzel. The plan was deemed rather unrealistic and even antagonizing to native Israelis back in 1978. But in the years after the Yom Kippur War, we very much see that these features that seemed so bizarre to Israeli bureaucrats at the time were actually realized in, suburban style settlements founded by and for Jewish American immigrants. The first case study that I looked at was that of the settlement of Yamit in the Sinai Peninsula, which has now been long forgotten to history as it was evacuated as part of the Israeli-Egyptian peace deal in 1982, but was a thriving community of secular American Jews who came to settle in their settlement by the sea in the Sinai, where they hoped to live out a kind of beach lifestyle, opening hotels and commercial enterprises, and even a bagel shop in the city center of Yamit, which was a dream held by these individuals who came from across the United States, and who's short-lived, but upon this group. But their paradise on the sea obviously was short-lived. When it became clear that there was going to be a full civilian and military disengagement for the Sinai Peninsula, they really see for future peace with the Palestinians. This was somewhat different than the settlement of Efrat, which is probably the largest and best known American Israeli settlement, which has always self-consciously billed itself as part of the Israeli consensus, and likely will not be evacuated if there is a future peace agreement with the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. What was different between Yamit, which was largely a city that was founded to house Israeli military families as much as American Jews who came for a little bit of adventure on the seaside, and even bourgeois community right in the middle of the West Bank, perhaps only a 20-minute drive today on bypass road to Jerusalem. It was founded by this man, often known as Stevie Wonder or Shlomo Stephen Riskin, who was a dynamic rabbi at Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan, and later joined up with this man, Moshe Mott, today jokingly known as Occupied Scarsdale, in the heart of the West Bank. Or as one woman I interviewed explained, a settlement where you could have both messianic redemption and a bagel and lox on Sunday morning. The story of this settlement is really one of radicalization since the First Intifada and the Oslo Accords, how a yuppie bourgeois national religious settlement and its rabbi who campaigned for civil rights in the United States have often turned against their liberal origins and opposed the Oslo peace process and other initiatives since then. We might recall that Yigal Amir, who later went on to murder Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, first cut his teeth as an ultranationalist activist and protested in Efrat in the summer of 1994. So this settlement, which remains the largest and most prominent American Israeli settlement, is really perhaps not quite as moderate as many of its inhabitants once saw themselves, but is really a kind of bellwether for the changing politics and, frankly, the shifting political spectrum in Israel today, that has, I think, seen that often religious tolerance and bourgeois community doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with political moderation, which is an important, I think, message for us to think about in today's society. Last but not least, the last settlement that I really took a look at in depth was the settlement of Tekoa, which was often referred to as, turn left at the end of the world, because back in 1982, it really looked like this, a kind of moonscape in the middle of the Judean desert. But also the left of the turn left at the end of the world really refers to the left-wing values of many of its founders, including two men I interviewed, Bobby Brown oh, sorry, I'm just I've just forgotten his name. I guess today is not my day. Who were really very active in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam struggles before they immigrated to Tekoa and really founded the settlement with their families and some other Russian immigrants who came to really intense violence with its Palestinian neighbors. It's right across the street from the Palestinian Palestinian town of Tekoa, and is really, I think, a immigrants who came, with peace, love, and happiness in their hearts, as one American immigrant told me in an interview, but found that they were really living at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yet at the same time, it's also been an interesting case study for religious toleration and even religious peacemaking, with the spiritual leadership of Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who died a few years ago, but was a very important figure in the 90s and 2000s, in leading initiatives for religious peacemaking, even meeting, as you can see here, with Yasser Arafat, but also at the time, even with Hamas leadership, to try to broker a peace deal that would be based upon religious principles of Jews and Muslims, to see whether there were new options to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's a very complicated place with, very complex points of view amongst its residents. But things have really changed significantly since the 1990s. And I think that the Israeli settler movement, unfortunately, and the participation of American Jews within it has really gone in two directions, as liberal values have clashed with settler realities. The first, of course, is what we've spoken of, is the participation of American Jewish immigrants within settler terrorism in the occupied territories. But I think the second and perhaps more curious form of activism was as media spokespeople to the international community, trying to discuss the project that they have dedicated their lives to in terms that, American viewers of CNN and Fox News might understand quite well. They've really tried to mobilize the language of human rights and liberal values to underscore a project on Jews to fight for, civil rights in the occupied territories. I think today, on this moment that we are reflecting on, terrific violence within territorial Israel, there seems to be a distinction between what happens over the Green Line and what happens within the Green Line. But unfortunately, I think some of these distinctions are increasingly being condensed, and that what these events of the last week may make us think differently about the kinds of justifications that those on the front lines of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have made. But I found it very curious in my own research to hear, Martin Luther King or human rights or the Declaration of Independence or marching on the streets of Washington being evoked as a justification for what happened on a Westbank hilltop. But that in many ways really leads me to my second project. And I want to only speak briefly about this as it's still in progress, but it really, I think, underscores that there's a lot that lies between what's happening on a hilltop of the West Bank and what's happening on Capitol Hill. But in many ways, those distinctions are becoming increasingly complicated as we think about how not only how American Jews have been active in domestic politics in Israel, but also how what's happened in Israel, particularly the increasing radicalism of the Israeli government policies on many controversial points, especially with the most recent administration that represents the most right-wing and religious coalition in Israeli history, that much of this has come back to affect our discussions here in the United States. I only need to look at Twitter or X this afternoon to see how much of what's happened over the past 50 years has come back to inform our discussion about how we are thinking about the intersection or even intersectionality today between Jewish power and identity politics. We've seen a lot about this in the, kind of ripped from the headlines news in the last several years. Is it possible to be a Zionist and a progressive? Can one be a Zionist and a feminist at the same time? How can one support Zionism as well as the struggle for LGBTQIA rights in the United States? We've seen many clashes that have happened between Jewish and other activists on the streets and certainly on social media on a regular basis, about this dilemma of Jewish participation within the progressive movement and how the policies of the state of Israel can inform community relates to other identity politics groups. The rise of that hyphenated identity that we spoke about 50 years ago of Jewish, of Jewish Americanness is also in turn allowed for other communities, particularly communities of color here in the United States, to celebrate their own backgrounds. And sometimes this has come into conflict. At the same time, while we see, intensive polarization on the left, we also see the beginnings of something that we couldn't have even dreamed of 50 years ago arising on the right. The idea of this new hyphenated Judeo-Christian establishment. In the 1950s, we didn't talk about, the Judeo-Christian establishment and some kind of alliance between Jews and Christians as being a likely possibility. But today we hear this discourse very actively from groups like Christians United for Israel or other supportive evangelical communities, and even unfortunately in the alt-right, which seems to, hate the Jews, but be very happy for them to not replace us by moving to Israel and, in support of the Zionist cause. So we're seeing, very, very stark polarization here in the United States. But I want to try and understand, going back to 50 years ago, the period between 1967 and 1975, which is the subject of my new research, really, how did we get to where we are today? And what does Israel have to do with all this in our own domestic politics here in the United States? So once again, I've returned to the 1967 war and be thinking about, this profound polarization that we see today, and how 1967 really began to transform diaspora Jewish life. The first most important intervention is that, while the Arab world may have, felt this way since 1948, since the beginning of the State of Israel, 1967 really remade Zionism from the national liberation of the Jewish people into a kind of white colonialist movement in the eyes of much of the international community. No longer was this a kind of David against Goliath story, but now one of Jewish power, where Israel had become a regional focus, where it was able to defeat the combined Arab armies and shatter the dream of Arab nationalism, and further become kind of, in the eyes of some, become a kind of bully on the block in the Middle East, with military power and political capital that had been unknown in the first 20 years of Israel's very precarious and difficult existence. And for many, this question of power also became one of colonialism, and even of a kind of whiteness of Israel's largely at that time, although we'll talk more in a moment about some demographic statements, Ashkenazi Jewish population, Jews who hailed from Eastern Europe, who may have had white skin or white pale skin, much like my Polish ancestors. And how this, transformation from Jewish power kind of started to turn Jews, particularly Israeli Jews, but also those Zionists in America who stood in solidarity with Israel, into white people. There's been a lot of literature about this question in academic circles, about how Jews became white folk. And it strikes me that many of you, when you're asked to, circle a box on a survey, of how you self-identify, perhaps you would circle the box that says white in lack of other alternatives, especially as identity politics have really tried to draw a color line. And Jews in the United States, despite the fact that we certainly are experiencing anti-Semitism, resurgent anti-Semitism here in the United States, and often do not have the same privileges and power as our white Christian neighbors, are often put today on the white side of this color line, partially because we can pass as white because of the nature of our skin tone, but also because whiteness has become part of a political discussion that really has nothing to do with our phenotypical characteristics, but is really about the question of power and privilege in American society. It is perhaps no coincidence that the term white skin privilege, or what we today know as white privilege, was actually coined by a Jewish American activist named Theodore A. Allen, who was a labor unionist, an intellectual and writer who moonlighted as a math teacher at the Crown Heights Yeshiva in the summer of 1967. And much of the literature has focused on some of the ways that American Jews have been able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, not only because of the values of Jewish communities, of education and intellectual probity, but also because we've benefited from some major social programs, not least the GI Bill and others that have allowed American Jews to rise in American society in ways that others others, particularly people of color who have been affected by structural racism, have not been able to do. And because of that, Jews have often, since the 1967 war, seemingly lost a kind of claim to victimhood, and are increasingly seen as part of the white privileged establishment, now having power, wealth, status, and the benefits of assimilation. So therefore, in the eyes of some, they must be part of the oppressor class and not amongst the oppressed. But that really brings about this very strange dichotomy that I think we are living with today in our own lives, that, we are both considered to be part of the white privilege structure, but also subject to resurgent anti-Semitism, which underscores that, we live in a register of both high and low. We may be both on the top of the, social privilege in terms of benefits of assimilation, but also at the bottom of society, not least because of what we're seeing today in the news, that, that the dilemma of, am I stinking vermin or am I ruling the world, still seems to define the American Jewish existence. So my new book project has really tried to go back to the 1967 war to really try and re-examine how this has come about. I've particularly been looking at the rise of what I call dual transnational clashing movements of Black power and Jewish power, which were both beginning to come into their own after the 1967 war, which have really, I think, set the stage for some of the dilemmas that we're having on the left today that continue into this current moment, as well as the, unraveling unanimity about Israel that I spoke about earlier. The 99% of American Jews that stood with Israel in 1967, our statistic might be somewhat less today, and how the 1967 war and its aftermath was understood by the American Jewish community, and some of the fissures that opened up, particularly between 1967 and 1975, not only because of our relationship with other groups, and particularly young millennials of the 1967 generation trying to understand their place in a new identity politics schema, but also how American Jews could understand how they related to others, between millennials and the Jewish establishment of the 1967 moment, between different American Jewish communities. The rising understanding of the American Jewish community, in fact, was quite pluralistic and has become even more pluralistic over time, and that there have been significant demographic change within the American Jewish community that has changed much of its politics. Last but not least, the confrontation with the understanding that Zionism is racism in 1975, perhaps a refrain that we're hearing once again today, that has deeply impacted both American Jewish identity and internal debates, but also how we relate to other identity politics groups, including those that may still hold that this is as true today as it was in 1975. So I guess I want to say that where we're going for the future is really thinking about, both how American Jews have influenced domestic Israeli politics, but also how Israeli domestic politics is increasingly influencing our own domestic politics, and what Jewish power and privilege may mean for the future. So I'm going to stop there, and I know that there will be questions also about current events, but I appreciate your attention to these prepared remarks today. Of course, we were not aware of what the events were going to be in Israel, but hopefully they've been helpful in understanding a little bit more about how American Jews are relating to Israel in this current moment and some of the changes over time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Hirschhorn, for a really fascinating, wide-ranging lecture, and for introducing us to both of your book projects. And I'm sure that there are many questions that the audience is going to have, so I'm going to remind everyone to take a moment and think through your questions and type them into the chat. I think one of the most helpful things that you've done here in presenting this history is, as we started, we are indeed living through an unprecedented moment, seeing sort of horrific events that we never imagined we would see in Israel in particular, that have echoes of the past. But at the same time, what you've also helped us to do is to see that the historical context that you provided can be helpful in terms of understanding the nature of the changing relationship between American Jews or the diaspora more largely and Israel, and how that might help us to understand what might happen in our present moment. Um, I see that people are starting to type questions in. I will ask a first question, and then I'll gather more of the questions as they come into the chat. I'm actually quite fascinated by something you ended with, which is the role of the settlement movement in Israeli domestic politics. And one of the things that's so interesting is you talked about, for example, the case of the Levingers, sort of settling in Hebron in 1968, and really in many ways, as you discussed in the quote, I think from Yitzhak Rabin, kind of really being outliers in the Israeli political scene and the Israeli, sort of national identity, and yet in many ways have become very successful in becoming a central part and a dominant part of the Israeli political scene. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that process has evolved and the ways in which sort of, let's say, native-born Sabras in the leading Israeli parties have interacted with the American-born settlers that you talked about, and the ways in which that has transformed the political establishment within Israel?
Yeah, so I think, maybe there's because the Israeli coalition today, reflects, the participation of the ultranationalist camp in such a significant way. I think we perhaps have come to think that this was always true of Israeli society. And in fact, Israel, after 1967, was still debating and dithering about what to do with the occupied territories for many years. Moshe Dayan famously said, we are waiting for the phone call from the Arab world, and there, has been much strategy devoted, I think, even until today, of the understanding of land for peace, that these were territories that were being held in the hopes that they could be exchanged for normalization agreements, much like we are now seeing with the Arab world in other ways in this moment, in the hopes for a different outcome. But as time went on, and certainly after the 1973 war, the civilian settlement in the occupied territories accelerated dramatically. And after 1977, with the election of Menachem Begin, the first Likud prime minister in Israeli history, which had been dominated by socialist Israeli governments up until 30 years, more than 30 years after its existence, this changed some of the political support for the Israeli settler enterprise. And saw the inclusion of the National Religious Party, which has been reincarnated in some of the new parties that we've seen on the ultranationalist coalition today, in a much more extreme version, I should say, into the government for the first time in 1977. But we should remember that even by 1980, only about 100,000 Israelis lived in the occupied territories, and even today, with the most wild estimates, depending on how you count and what you consider to be the Israeli settlements, does that include parts of Jerusalem that are technically over the Green Line, but have been annexed to the municipality of Jerusalem back in 1967 or otherwise? We're talking about 500,000 Jewish Israeli settlers, which is of a population of 10 million Israelis, is still a somewhat small contingent, but certainly punch above their weight in Israeli politics. And I think that can be understood because the Israeli settler movement has increasingly become a key part of Israel's security and economic strategy. First, of course, that it provides a kind of territorial buffer between Israel and Palestinians. We see this today also in the kibbutzim on the Gaza border, which unfortunately, were infiltrated in the past several days. But certainly the settlements have become part of that understanding, and also land that has been traded back in the past for some other kind of arrangement. First, the Sinai Peninsula, which was returned to Egypt in 1982 and has allowed for at least a kind of cold peace or functional arrangement to flourish between Israel and the Egyptian government, or the disengagement from Gaza in 2006, which unfortunately has led to many of the events that we are witnessing today. But at least in the eyes of the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and his cabinet and many others at the time, this was hoped to be a arrangement that will allow for Gaza to have autonomy and to no longer, be part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the, demographic realities, which today have become even more pressing of a one-state solution. Further, the Israeli settlements, which I think it gets a lot less press, but is an important part of understanding the stereotype of the Israeli settlements, which is all about security and ideology, are also a really core piece of Israel's economic strategy today. If you want to buy a cheap house with a nice backyard in Israel, one of the first places you might think about, if you weren't going to go down to a kibbutz down by the Gaza border, is perhaps settling in the occupied territories. It has been a way to allow for the proliferation of the Israeli public out of, major overcrowded, really expensive cities in territorial Israel, and new zones of economic development, and generally part of the social fabric of Israel. There are secular people who live in the occupied territories, there are ultra-Orthodox, and everybody in between, including the national religious, but not only the national religious. So it's become, part of the landscape, no pun intended, of Israel writ large, and it's become a force and a place that people who would never in a million years dream of living in a settlement also support, because their relatives, their friends, their army buddies, their work colleagues, their former next door neighbors have moved there. So I think it helps explain why it's become such an integral part of Israeli policy and strategy, despite the fact that demographically it's still a really rather small part of the Israeli voting public.
Yeah, no, and I think that this context is so important that you're providing, right? That there, as you started with the slide where you presented sort of the stereotypes of the settlers versus this being a much broader, more complicated phenomenon that also deals with certain economic issues. I mean, one of the, if not the most expensive country in the world to live in on the OECD index, real estate cost is a very real issue, and the real estate is much less expensive in the West Bank or in the occupied territories. People are gonna, need places to live, and that's a factor as well. Okay, there's a number of questions that have come in, and so I'd like to try to get to as many as possible. There's a question from Rosalind, which I can answer in brief if you want to add anything, that asks, was there a country called Palestine before the state of Israel was created? If not, what was the area called? So on the one hand, there's sort of the straight answer of as a British mandate, having the mandate over Palestine after the First World War, technically from 1920 until 1948 when the British withdrew. So this territory was referred to as Palestine, or British Mandate Palestine. There might be another question in there about sort of Palestine as the home of the Palestinian state, and sort of this being famously an obstacle to peace. I don't know if that's part of the question. I don't know if you want to address that, or I can keep going.
Yeah, I just want to say that the name Palestine obviously comes from the Roman days of Palestina, when the Romans were basically, I guess we could say, occupying the area or the piece of real estate that is now Israel Palestine. It's changed hands any number of times, most recently in the modern era, first as part of the Ottoman Empire, then later the British Mandate. Between 1948 and 1967, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were essentially carved out by regional powers. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, which is why today we're seeing such intensive negotiation with Egypt, because they still have kind of an historic legacy of controlling border crossings, and have had political dealings with all the major parties in Gaza, since, for now over 70 years. The West Bank was controlled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan renounced its claims to the West Bank in the 1980s, and subsequently, the idea that a Palestinian state would come about on something like 92% of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and some part of East Jerusalem has come into political lexicon during the Oslo Accords. But I guess we should say that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories is not the first occupation or the first overlord that the Palestinians have known. In fact, they have never known their own independence, and they have been ruled by Ottomans and Arabs and other regimes basically throughout the history of this piece of territory.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Okay, there's a question here from Alan, Alan Berkowitz, which I think follows up also on both on the real estate question, but also just very technically the acquisition of territory. Can you discuss how prospective Jewish communities, Alan asks, acquired the properties to create settlements in the territories? So how did this work,
Right.
on a legal basis in an area that's under military occupation?
Right. So Israeli land codes in general are very complicated because they've inherited a whole legal system of land management that goes back to the Ottoman regime and then was complicated further by British procedure. And Israel owns basically a lot of state land, and they have declared much of the West Bank as well as much of territorial Israel. For anybody who knows, who's bought an apartment in Israel, knows that actually a lot of times your apartment is technically owned by the government. You're only sort of subleasing that from the state of Israel. That have been used to acquire pieces of territory in the West Bank, although some has actually been bought from neighboring Palestinian communities. Of course, others have been seized as closed military zones or as national parks or as other ways of codifying land usage that have been to the settler advantage. And of course, there are settlements that have been, outright appropriated by Israeli communities for civilian use. That are even considered illegal by the state of Israel. So there's various modes of land management and acquisition. Of course, the question is not only about the precise legal details of each one of these land parcels, but more the existential question of where, if one is going to arise, is the future Palestinian state going to be? Is it going to be in basically the whole of the West Bank, or 92% of the West Bank, which will require the withdrawal of the Israeli forces and an evacuation of Israeli settlers from major cities, cities and settlements in the West Bank? The Gaza Strip, obviously, Israeli settlements were already removed in 2006. Or is the future Palestinian state going to be some very different kind of territorial constellation? I don't think we really know, but it's a kind of legal question about the land proper as much as a bigger existential question about what do we think is going to happen if and when a Palestinian state comes into existence.
Yeah. And I think we're still going to wait to see what happens in the next weeks and months, but I think all of those calculations are going to change as well as a result of October 7th.
Absolutely.
A question that has come in from my colleague Yoni Miller, hi Yoni, who says, who asks, would you say that there's a pan-Anglophone ideological discourse about the settlements, or is it mostly an American phenomenon? And deeper into the question, Yoni says, are there separate ideas among, say, British, Australian, and South African Olim, right? So are we talking about, you focused on sort of the American settlement, American, Jewish Americans, the Israeli Americans, but Yoni asked about the broader Anglophone movement.
I really appreciate Yoni's question, probably because he knows that I have broader interests beyond just the American Jewish case. And in fact, in recent years, I spent time in South Africa. I lived for 5 years in the UK when I was teaching at Oxford. And of course, have spent some time with the Canadian Jewish community. Unfortunately, I've not yet been to Australia, but, many other parts of the Anglophone Jewish community. And I really have to say that my hobby horse is really to say that Diaspora-Israel relations is not synonymous with American Jewish-Israel relations. Each one of these diasporas has a very different and very complicated relationship with Israel based on their own needs and ideas about what Zionism means to them. And frankly, what Zionism means as a place of refuge is very different for American Jews than it may be for South African Jews or Ukrainian Jews or French Jews that have much more exigent reasons to see Israel is a place for them to physically escape as much as a place to ideologically identify on the basis of, shared values of democracy. So there are very different relationships between, when I put my policy hat on, I guess one of the things that I would say is that I wish the diaspora community was able to speak with much more of a unified voice on many issues. Because even though we have many different, we have different different views and needs, there were times where it would be best if we really could come together, and unfortunately, that's not always possible. Perhaps the events of the past week of Jewish community, as much as Israelis, rallying together at this moment. But when it comes to settlements itself, we do see a presence of other foreigners in the settlements. We don't know that much in terms of numbers or statistics about other Anglophone communities, but certainly they are present. Efrat, of course, was a settlement that was founded by both South African and American Jews together under the leadership of Rabbi Riskin, a story that unfortunately is mostly yet to be told by the scholarship, not something that I really engaged in. One of the questions that I really comparative work looking at both the United States and South Africa, because South Africa, of course, has had a very, interesting relationship with Israel, and this question of Jewish whiteness, because the apartheid laws juridically classified Jews as white people. And that legacy has really affected their standing in post-apartheid South Africa. In these questions about Zionism as racism and who is, part of the oppressor class in a new South Africa, and the South African Jewish relationship with Israel, during apartheid and certainly after apartheid has been one, very very entrenched and very perhaps different from the American Jewish case. And I'd really hope to include that. COVID, I think, got in the way of doing a lot more research in South Africa, though I'd spent some time there before the pandemic. And I really hope that we'll be able to think about some of these questions in a global perspective going forward, because I think they are affecting all Jewish communities right now who are struggling with these questions about government policy on domestic diaspora futures, and each one of them is really grappling with these questions in different ways, that they have really different national experiences that make the outcomes look somewhat different from the United States because of the particularities of these places as much as our own experience.
Yeah, thank you. And I think as you're, and I'll just say, Sarah, that your video is freezing up a little bit, but we hear you okay now. But if it drops out, we'll let you back into the meeting. It's a little choppy. And thank you for explaining sort of the complexities of I think there are multiple books to be written here about sort of distinguishing between the South Africans, the British, the Australians, and then within those countries, the distinctions, let's say between Jews from Melbourne and Jews from Sydney. It's really fascinating. Okay, we have two more questions here. If you're up for it, we'll go through two more questions. So Gary Starr asks a question which really, I think, draws upon your most recent book project and your newest research. Gary asks, are there any historical examples of the white privilege / power and anti-Semitism that would help address the left's exclusion of Jewish liberals from the progressive movement, that would help us develop a strategy for overcoming this opposition? Are Americans in the West Bank a cause for this exclusion of the Jews on the left here? So sort of, can you help us think through some of the tangled knots that you left us with in terms of Jews and the left in America today, this question of whiteness? What's the relationship between sort of the American Jews and the settlement movement and this sort of the thorny issue of white privilege, power, and anti-Semitism that Gary brings up?
I'm going to leave the question about Americans and settlements for a moment and sort of answer the question about historical cases. And in fact, I think that's the mission of my whole second book. Is I have a lot of millennial college students that come into my office and say, I'm progressive, I'm Democrat, I'm part of a lot of social movements on campus, I may be a Jew of color, I'm gay, I'm biracial. I'm supportive of a whole host of progressive causes, but at the same time, I grew up with a strong Jewish identity, and I think, although maybe I'm not sure, or I'm not sure even what that word means, I think I'm a Zionist. So how do I reconcile these different identities in a kind of coherent package for myself? And how do I, how can I be active in in the college space where it's really hard to hold all those those identities in one hand, and also, find, frankly, not just a political place, but even a social place on a university campus right now, where things, I think, Avi can probably attest to this as well, are quite tense and, very polarizing, often for very young people who are struggling with these questions themselves with less tools, less experience to answer that question in some kind of coherent way. And I'm not going to claim that I do have a coherent answer for them, but the best thing I can say is to refer them to the millennials of the 1960s and 1970s who are trying to grapple with some of these questions themselves, and I think have offered some paths forward to try and understand how. I'm looking particularly at movements of radical Zionism and radical Jews in the 1960s and 1970s who really saw their radicalism or their progressivism as a core part of their Jewish identity, but also in 1967, we're Zionists, and we're seeing not only the rise of Black power, but also the change in the New Left as they came to Israel that they were living through in real time, and trying to understand how they could still be Zionists in the face of a significant change in American and world opinion when it came to Israel. And they've articulated some very strong statements and points of view at the time that I think are worth, kind of restoring to our memories, and and maybe rereading at this moment of history, to see that there were people who were having these conversations 50 years ago who were facing very similar sets of circumstances. That this is really a reiteration of old debates. There's nothing new under the sun. We had these conversations, did try to discuss some alternatives. We also saw some, opportunities as well as failures by the American Jewish establishment to address these questions, and the ways different groups within the American Jewish community, that there was different denominational groups or other kinds of social movements within American Jewry, tried to square this allyship with other identity politics groups in the United States, and their Zionism, and even resurgent anti-Semitism in the 1960s and 70s that many of us have forgotten today, but was also a part of the larger dilemma back then too. So this all isn't that new, and I think we can just look to the past to try and understand the present and the future.
Yeah, thank you. And it's as you suggested, right? This current moment is extremely fluid that we're living in right now, and I think you're right that, as you suggested, for college students right now, it's extremely confusing, right? To want to be identified with progressive causes and sort of be on the right side of progressive causes, and I mean the proper, correct side of progressive causes, but also feeling that tension with feeling persecuted and targeted because of some aspects of their Jewish identity. And I think it's going to get even more challenging, right? And so I think we do have a role to play in sort of trying to provide some examples from the past and some guidance to try to help them through this, what I think is going to be a very, very difficult period. I see one last question here, if from my colleague Sebastian Wogenstein, who, and I think this is a good question with us to wrap up on. Sebastian asks, you've touched on the current situation already a bit. Could you please say more how, or if you think the current war will affect discourse on the settlements within Israeli society? And I'll just expand upon that, if Sebastian will indulge me, beyond sort of thinking about how the current war will affect discourse in the settlements within Israeli society. Also, how do you think it might affect the American Jewish perspective on settlements as well, in the light of what we've witnessed over the last few days?
So first, I think we may need to address the elephant in the room, which is that it's not only about the future of settlements, but it's about the future Palestinian state. And I think it's very hard to say what that's going to look like in coming weeks and months. About certainly, I don't think anybody sees a return. If there indeed is a kind of full-scale ground invasion of Gaza, this may lead the Israeli army to reoccupy Gaza for some period of time to stabilize the situation, stabilize, these captives that were taken from southern border communities, or Palestinian state, and with Hamas, with the goal of this ground invasion to fully decapitate both the military and political wing of Hamas. It also leads to a lot of questions about, in fact, who will be in charge of the Gaza Strip. Well, there's going to be a significant power vacuum. Will this allow for the Palestinian Authority itself? This summer was certainly on its knees. Some were even saying that the Palestinian Authority has essentially ceased to exist, prior to October 7th. So it's very uncertain, really, who's in charge of Palestinian leadership right now, what that's going to look like in coming weeks and months, and what we could say about, who is actually going to be in charge of these, still in control of the West Bank, or in larger control of the West Bank, but now also reoccupying Gaza, and that will be a generational change when we come to talking about future Palestinian states. Certainly, some of the military and political ideologies about why Israel would want to be sovereign in these territories, if only to forestall the kind of terrible atrocities that we've seen in coming days. I don't think that most Israelis support that, but certainly there is a great fear now, I think, amongst Israelis about what could happen, with a perhaps hostile state living side by side with Israel. Because the state would be at peace with Israel at the moment, should it come into existence. So I think it redefines the Palestinian question altogether. We also know that perhaps these operations the last few days, Israel normalization deal and other previous Arab normalization agreements, which seem to have sidelined the question of Palestinian statehood or diminished it in the eyes of both the Arab public and policymakers, and the Palestinians are very strongly reacting to the idea that Palestinian statehood in some ways was being taken off the table, without their acquiescence by not only by Israel, but also by surrounding or even more remote Arab states, and that this has been part of a larger discussion even prior to the events of October 7th and what the retaliation by Israel. I think also this question of the invasion of southern communities in territorial Israel, has kind of collapsed some of the security distinctions between what is a settlement? Is a settlement Tekoa, or is a settlement, if Hamas is saying that Israel is a settler colonial state that is occupying all of historical Palestine, does that mean for Hamas that Tekoa is a settlement or Tel Aviv is a settlement? Is Kibbutz Be'eri, where we've seen children do meme in the West Bank? I think this raises a lot of questions for the Israeli public about sort of the collapsing of the green line, or the collapse of what used to be the border, that on some level to kind of an outlier to the larger territorial Israel project, maybe one that Israeli governments hope to gain full sovereignty over, or in a future Palestinian state, to absorb some civilian settlements in the West Bank in particular into territorial Israel. But I think no one really imagined the territorial Israeli communities would be attacked in such a way. And in some ways that, collapses this distinction between the security corridor of the West Bank and territorial Israel, and communities they're within the green line. So I think that may change some of the calculations for future Israeli governments when they come to think about this. But certainly that also puts a lot of pressure on Israel's national security. One of the critiques of this, obviously colossal intelligence and operational failure was that too much of Israeli ground forces had been in the West Bank all summer, protecting Israeli settlements, leaving the southern border almost entirely undefended. And I think that will also come into play here as a real severe critique of the continuing presence of civilians in the West Bank. It's just that this is now putting Israel's national security, the larger project of territorial Israel, under threat, and that just from a force reallocation perspective, and I guess the future of the state of Israel, that is that kibbutz Berry or is that kedumim? Where is Israel putting its focus, and what is realistic going forward, whether or not there's going to be a return to the diplomatic table coming into play? I think that's going to also change some of the questions here. As for what this means for American Jews, I think American Jews right now are just struggling with how to kind of shed the weight of the past 6 months in Israel of the judicial reform protests, the real violence, the spiraling violence in the West Bank, other questions about Israeli domestic politics, and now sort of rally around the core issues of defending Israel in its time of need. So I think the American Jewish community is trying to focus on what's in front of them right now. But I do imagine that when the dust settles, we'll be returning to many of those core questions about particularly about shared values, which is, basically the premise of our relationship right now. That as democracies, we stand against terror, that we protect our civilians, that we, we do to maintain the integrity of liberal democratic states under threat. But the West Bank settlement project, in particular, in recent years, I think has called into question that idea of shared values. And when the dust settles, I imagine we'll be revisiting those debates that have been only amplified by recent events. So I don't really know where these questions stand, but obviously, as Avi said, this is a really fluid and dynamic situation. And I think a lot of the assumptions we had about what the map of this region looks like or may look like are going to change dramatically in coming days.
Wow. Well, Dr. Hirschhorn, let me thank you for really a fascinating and insightful discussion. As you suggest, this is a very complex topic, and we're in a very complex moment. And we're certainly living through a turning point. We just don't know what direction things are going to turn. So I want to thank you on behalf of our co-sponsors for tonight's program, the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford and the Mandel JCC. I want to thank you on behalf of the UConn Center for Judaic Studies for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And when the book comes out, I think everyone would love to have you back in our community and to learn more from you. So let me invite everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause. So you can see everybody applauding in the background. And thank you all for being
I really
here with
appreciate
us.
everybody coming here tonight. I know we all have a lot on our minds.
Indeed. Yeah.
I'm sorry to say, as an historian, we never want to say that you're living through historic times, and I know that that's what we're living through, and I appreciate your being here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us. And there is something that feels good about being together, and let's pray for better days ahead. So thank you so much, Sara, and thank you everyone for being here, and good night.